The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, is with me now. Welcome, Chancellor.
Good morning,
Can I ask
Andrew.
you, first of all, something I asked Paul Johnson earlier in the show. What is your overall view of where the economy is in terms of the big numbers, borrowing, unemployment, growth and so forth? Where are we now?
Well, we'll get a clear sense next week when we do the spending review, and alongside that, the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility will publish their forecast. But I can tell you, it's a very difficult picture. The economy is experiencing significant stress. We've seen that particularly in the labour market with people's jobs. We know that 750,000 people have tragically already lost their jobs, with forecasts of more to come. Borrowing, we saw the numbers last week at a record peacetime levels already, and more stress to come. And that is it's very sad to see. It's not just numbers on a chart. It's people's lives. It's their livelihoods, their security that's being impacted, and it's something that we're going to grapple with for a while to come, sadly.
Lots to talk about. Before we do, a lot of people watching simply want to know, is it absolutely clear that this lockdown ends on December the 2nd, no matter what the level of infections or even death rates?
Yes, that is absolutely right. Prime Minister's been crystal clear on that. And indeed, as a matter of law, that is what will happen. The regulations expire on that date. And the Prime Minister will be making a statement tomorrow and setting out further plans. But we will be going back into a more localised approach, a tiered system, which I think is enormously welcome. It's
a much tougher tiered system.
Yes, I mean, and I think that what people should realise is we learn more as we go through this crisis, and as we get more data, more information, we can see what works well, what doesn't, and essentially evolve our response to make sure it's as effective as it can be. But I think the crucial thing is a localised response is something that is entirely preferable, and that's what we will go back to after the 2nd.
For most people, is their local pub, their local restaurant going to have to stay closed until Christmas?
Well, so the Prime Minister will set out more details
Sure.
about that this week. But you talk about pubs and restaurants. The hospitality industry has been one that has been acutely impacted by what's happened over the past few months. I'm aware of that. It employs 2 million people. It's an important part of our economy and a part of our social life as well. And we will constantly have it at the top of our mind.
I mean, the reason I'm asking you as Chancellor about this is that so many of these businesses make their profits between now and Christmas or shortly after Christmas. And if they can't open, they will go probably forever. And so it's a massive, massive economic question as to how much of the economy you're going to allow as a government to keep going between now and Christmas and possibly make the money that allows them to survive into next year and the year after that.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And particularly for retail, it is November and December are very important months for the calendar. We've put a lot of support into these sectors, and you'll know the various initiatives we've done, the VAT cuts, tax cuts, business rates, holidays, cash grants, and that continues through the winter, whether it's the furlough programme or indeed the direct cash grants for hospitality and leisure businesses, whether they're open or closed, that will help them tide through. But it is difficult, and we have that in our mind. There are lots of impacts of the crisis, and it's right that we have all of them in our mind as we make these decisions.
Before this lockdown, 20% of the population of England were under Tier 3, which meant their pubs were closed. Is that going to be the same after the lockdown?
Well, the Prime Minister is going to make more announcements about the process for this next week, so I don't want to preempt that.
Idea. I mean, there's a lot of people watching who are just desperate to know.
I know they are, and I appreciate that. And there's a cabinet meeting later today which will discuss these, and then the Prime Minister will set out the details next week. So I appreciate people are eager for information. But I would say is, I think the most important thing to know is we're exiting these national restrictions and going back to this localised approach, which is definitely better.
What about shops? Will non-essential shops, the places we go to buy our Christmas presents between now and Christmas, will they be allowed to be reopened?
Again, I'm sorry, but not to be able to give you the precise answer. But so you made an important
yes
point.
Or no,
Yeah, well, so we're having a cabinet discussion later on this afternoon to make final decisions. So it would be wrong for me to preempt that, and the Prime Minister will set these out from tomorrow. But you make an important point about the importance of retail to our economy and this time of year, and we will have all these things in our mind.
Presumably, as the Chancellor, you would like to see as much open as possible.
Oh, of course, from an economic perspective, as you rightly said, restrictions on businesses' ability to trade is enormously damaging, not just for them, but for the people that they employ. And it's right that we have that in our mind as we think about getting the balance between these things right.
One relatively small thing which caused a huge amount of comment was the 10 p.m. curfew. Is that going to go?
It's definitely something that we're looking at, and I think, as I said, one of the things that we've been able to do as we've learned is get data, see what works, and see where we can improve things. I think it's probably fair to say when we introduced the curfew, that was something that was in common with many other countries and cities around the world. But as we've learned more, there are opportunities for us to look and refine things, and that is one of the things on our list.
Earlier on in the programme, Paul Johnson was talking about the overarching shape of the economy. And he said this huge, huge wall of debt that we've now accumulated, it has to be paid off, has to be paid down, but probably not yet, maybe not for a few years. It's still the time to carry on spending for a bit to support the economy, and then we will all have to pay higher taxes eventually to pay for it. Is that, broadly speaking, the truth?
Well, I'll give you my view of it, and I think now is the right time to focus on responding to the crisis, and that means, yes, we will be borrowing, quite frankly, an enormous sum this year to help us do that, but that is the right thing to do for the long-term health of the economy and public finances, and we're doing that to protect people's jobs, their livelihoods, support businesses, as we've talked about, but also provide the funds necessary to fight coronavirus, and that will be at the centre of the spending review next week. We'll be providing those funds, whether it's for testing, for vaccines, for the NHS, and that's the right thing to do now, and that is an approach that's been endorsed by the IMF, the OBR, and the Bank of England and others.
What is the avoidable evil in terms of the health service that you're offering more money to get round or avoid?
Well, today we've announced that we will make available an extra £3 billion on top of the record settlement that the NHS anyway is enjoying, and that's to tackle some of the backlog of things that have built up over the past few months as we were dealing with coronavirus. So that will mean that we can do 1 million more treatments, for more scans, more elective surgery. We've also made more money available for diagnostic equipment to replace some of the older ones. But that illustrates, again, what are one of the other impacts of tackling coronavirus was all these things that were meant to happen that couldn't sadly happen, and it's right that we make a start on tackling that backlog, and that's what this funding will do.
What about my viewers who are on universal credit? They've had an extra 20 quid and they're really hoping that that's going to be maintained going forward for a while.
Well, to those viewers, what I'd say is that, I know this is a very difficult time for them and for everyone in their different ways through this. We've put a range of different support in place right at the beginning of this when there was such acute anxiety and worry for the country. But the good news is that support lasts all the way to next spring, and that is there alongside lots of other things we've done, helping with people's council tax bills, mortgage holidays.
Is that going to go forward?
It was a temporary increase that lasts all the way to next spring, in line with many of other measures, by the way, to support whether it's furlough or business rates, holidays. As we get through this and we have more certainty about the future, we can decide what the best way to support the economy, businesses, and crucially people's jobs and their livelihoods, and we'll make those decisions as we go through.
Let me ask you about the furlough, because back in September you said it's fundamentally wrong to hold people in jobs that only exist inside the furlough. Going forward, isn't that exactly what you're now doing?
I think that, what changed is that the restrictions that we needed to put in place obviously became more severe, and we're back in essentially for the last month, we've had national restrictions that have again closed large swathes of our economy down. That's what's changed. At the time that we made those decisions to move away from furlough to a new system, we were in the process of opening up the economy, believing that test and trace could help suppress the spread of the virus and we could use a localized approach. Now, if we're in that world, then it's absolutely right that we evolve our support to allow people to work and encourage work. But when the economy is now, as it is, closed down, that approach isn't right, and it's right that we evolved it as the health restrictions changed.
Now, one of the more controversial aspects of the support you've been given is support for self-employed people, because there's a huge number of people, 3 million or so, who haven't had the self-employment help early on. And it looks as if part of the trouble has been that the system wasn't well designed first time round, and you just brought in the same system again second time round. There's a lot of unhappiness up and down the country about people who thought that they deserved the help, and the IFS and others have done work on the numbers of this, so it's not lobbyists talking, it's proper economic analysis. Lots of people have not had the support they deserve and need, and some of them are in desperate straits.
So let's take a step back. I think our support for self-employed has been more comprehensive and generous than almost any other country in the world. Between 3.5 and 4 million people have been eligible for that support. And I probably would slightly take issue with the idea that 3 million people have been excluded, as you said. I think actually your BBC reality fact check thing looked at this, and the largest number of those people are actually people who are not majority self-employed, which means they're actually they make more money from employment rather than self-employment.
Yeah, but they may still have a huge gap.
Well, hang on.
If I rest back, not on anybody else's figures, but IFS and other figures, it says 7 out of 8 workers don't qualify for the £500 payment for self-isolation, for instance.
So that's something different. But let's just talk about the self-employment issue. And so of the 3 million people, the majority of those who you said are excluded are not. It's just that they're not majority self-employed. Now, Paul Johnson, as you said, thinks that we should be targeted. That's one way of targeting that support on those who predominantly make their earnings from self-employment. Now, of those, I think it's around 1.5 million people who don't make the majority of their income from self-employment. On average, their self-employment income for those people is about £2,000 or £3,000. So for them, it is not the primary overwhelming source of their livelihoods. And if it was at that level, they obviously can benefit from the changes we've made to the welfare system.
And well, let me turn to self-isolation. Do you accept that one of the problems we've had up to now is that not enough people have been self-isolating because they can't afford to?
No, well, so I think there's lots of different views on this.
That's a big issue, though, isn't it?
Well, I think it's important to realise why are people not complying if they're not complying. Now, we don't have brilliant data on this. The data I've seen, actually, in the Department of Health has done its own, is that there are lots of people, lots of reasons. Going to work is not the primary reason that people decide not to comply with self-isolation. It's actually loneliness, isolation, or an improvement in their symptoms, or indeed to go shopping. Those are all higher reasons than going to work.
Chancellor, can I read back to you what SAGE says? They say the current rates of complete adherence to self-isolation by people with symptoms, blah, 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 based on self-report with adherence systems particularly low among younger populations and from socio-economically disadvantaged communities. That's people who don't have enough money to self-employ. Given that self-report is subject to bias, many people may be unlikely to admit lack of adherence to the rules. That could be even higher than reported. So in other words, they say pretty clearly that one of the big problems is people simply don't have the cash to self-isolate, and that's something you could do something about.
Well, so we have done something about that, and we've made £500.
Right, you could do more about it.
Well, we can always do more on everything, right? So we have to just try and prioritise where we're best using our resources, Andrew. But we do have £500 available for people who think that will make a difference to them. It's means tested rightly. Many people benefit from sick pay from their companies or other, which are often more generous than the statutory limit, so they'll have that support as well. But the £500 does make a difference, and as you'll know, we are looking at ways in which it might be possible to bring forward the date that people can exit isolation if they are a contact of someone. And now that we've got more testing capacity, that is something that we've said that we will look at. I think that will make the biggest difference, because obviously 14 days feels like a long time. It is a long time, as the Prime Minister is experiencing at the moment. And if there was an ability to reduce that whilst not compromising our ability to have the virus under control, that would be something that would be good to be able to do.
In terms of an economic model, what's your prediction about the effect of a no-deal Brexit on the British economy next year?
Well, I think that obviously the OBR, as I said, are the independent forecasters, and we'll talk about this next week. But what I'd say is, I think we're making progress in the talks, and I remain hopeful that we can reach resolution. I think we're being entirely reasonable with our requests and have been consistent and transparent through this process about what's important to us. But we will prosper in any eventuality, and I think the opportunities that we have.
My question is a little more specific. It is, what is the effect on the economy of not having a trade agreement with the EU next year? I asked Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, about that. He said it's not really my responsibility. As it were, wait till Rishi Sunak's in the studio. So here I am with you.
Well, I think. Well, first of all, I think it's very difficult to be precise about the near-term effects. But I'd agree with what the Prime Minister has said. Look, in the short term specifically, and most immediately, it would be preferable to have a deal, because it wouldn't ease things in the short term. But I think the most important impact on our economy next year is not going to be from that. It's because of coronavirus. It's what we started talking about at the beginning of this interview, and the scale of economic shock that we are experiencing as a result of that is really the dominant thing, and that's why all my attention is focused on trying to protect as many jobs as possible through that, provide the support to people and businesses through
the reason I want to hover over a little bit over Brexit is that is something that politicians, as it were, are responsible for, which they're not responsible for the coronavirus. Now, there was modelling done by thanks to Andy Street, the Conservative mayor, up in the West Midlands. Birmingham University modelled the effect of no deal and tariffs on the car economy in the West Midlands, and that said there could be a drop of more than 12% of the GDP of the West Midlands economy if we face those tariffs. That is a huge hit for an area we're supposed to be levelling up.
So I haven't seen that particular report, so I can't comment on the precise details. But what would I say is we had this debate a while ago. We had a referendum on it, then we had an election on it, and we've now left the European Union. But
we have it in our power to have either to go a little bit further to get some kind of deal or not. And I'm just looking at the effects of not.
Yeah, well, we should not be going for a deal at any price. That would be the wrong thing to do. And I think there are things that are important to us in these negotiations. And we've been entirely, as I said, I think reasonable,
nobody is saying a deal at any
and
price.
Transparent. Well, ultimately, that's what it comes down to. We're in a negotiation. I think we've been reasonable, consistent and transparent throughout the process about our asks, which, by the way, are very... So we just want pretty much the same treatment as most other countries that do trade deals with the EU get. So, as I said, I think, hopefully, we can find a constructive place. But I'm very confident about the British economy in all circumstances when I think longer term. I made a speech recently about the opportunities in financial services for us to do things differently. We recently announced a bidding process for free ports, again, an economic innovation that will drive jobs and growth in areas around our country. We now have a new immigration regime that we can put in place as a result of leaving. Those are all the opportunities people voted for, and those are the opportunities we are delivering.
Okay, let's come a little bit further, closer to home. Is it right that if I have government contracts, or I know senior Conservatives, I am 10 times more likely to get a contract for PPE than if I don't?
Well, look, I don't know specifically that number, but I would say, let's think back to the start of this crisis, right? Those days in late March, early April. And you all remember, I'm sure, whether it was me or others on your show, we spent our time, desperately worried about
Sure.
PPE and everything else. And on the economic side, I was also reacting very quickly. So,
But you just said to me, not at any cost, about Brexit. I put the same thing back to you when it comes to contracts. The Department of Health paid a company called Ianda Capital £155 million for 50 million face masks, which couldn't fit government specifications and couldn't therefore be used. Was that a good use of government money?
well, so let's go back. Let's go back to that period when this is what dominated everything that we were talking about. And so, do I think at that moment the right thing, either on the economic side or on the health side, would have been to say, well, let's run a procurement process for 30 or 60 days, or do I think the right thing was to act fast? Whether it's on the economic side is what I did. I acted broadly and knowing that we were going to do things that were right for a crisis. And I do believe that was the right thing to do.
No one's against acting fast, but acting fast to buy face masks that don't work and spending all that kind of money on that, a company which did have a particular connection with the government, seems to a lot of people simply a misuse of public money.
Well, as I said, I wasn't involved in this particular contract. There's obviously a process that all these contracts go through. But when you're in the midst of a crisis and we're trying to ensure that we have enough PPE, whether it was for care homes at the time or the country more generally, it was right to try and do everything we can. And I'm not going to apologise for us reacting in that way. I think it's all fine now to look back. But at that moment, every time someone was on your show or anyone else, what people wanted to know is, do we have enough PPE to keep our health workers safe? And that's what we were trying to do.
You have a very stressful life. Have you ever unintentionally bullied anyone?
Look, obviously bullying is not appropriate and it's not an effective way to get the best out of people.
But if somebody in your office, which is a very, very busy office, was shouting and swearing, would they keep their job?
Look, I don't think shouting is an effective way to get the best out of people, but it is necessary sometimes to be direct in order to drive progress in an organisation, particularly under stressful circumstances. But I think
we both know we're talking about
exactly.
Priti
So
Patel.
why don't we just address the
Home
specific
Secretary.
issue? Yeah.
Yes, it is said that the Prime Minister had asked the official concerned in this report to water down the language. Would that have been an appropriate thing to do?
Well, that's not what happened, and the independent advisor conducted a detailed review at the request of the Prime Minister because he takes this matter very seriously, and that's right because it is a serious issue. And that review concluded. The findings have been published. The Prime Minister has spent a lot of time considering them in the round, has reached the conclusion that Priti is not a bully, and she has offered a full and unreserved apology for what's happened. And as far as the Prime Minister is concerned, that draws a line under this, and we should get back to focusing on what people want, which is tackling crime and making sure that our communities are safe. And on a personal level, I've worked closely with Priti and found her to be entirely kind and very focused and passionate about what she does.
Rishi Sunak, thanks very much indeed for coming in.